you. It's always a pleasure to have you generously sharing your mind with us, and really looking forward to this talk. And also congratulations on the new book.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mike. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. And I prepare for today a PowerPoint, so I will need to share my screen with you. So play from the start. Perfect. So we start at the beginning. So this is the title of my talk, The Monsters Within, the Monsters Without, the descent of psychoanalysis, and a question that is very pertinent and maybe a little disquieting. Is there a future for psychoanalysis? Hopefully, after today, we may have, if not a final answer, at least some guidelines of how to project ourselves onto the future and how to imagine it. I would take as point of departure what I consider a wake-up call for psychoanalysis, and I would refer to a talk given by Paul Preciado a few years ago, was to be exact, on November 17th, 2019. This was, I think, one of the last in-person meetings just before the lockdown, the global lockdown due to the pandemic. And on that occasion, Paul Preciado spoke to an audience of psychoanalysts, Lacanian psychoanalysts, 3,500 psychoanalysts gathered in Paris. This was an annual meeting organized around one theme, which was women in psychoanalysis. Here we have the poster of the talk. Preciado opened the talk with perhaps a perplexing observation. In psychoanalysis, there are women, as they invited him as being the keynote speaker for the occasion. As we know, Paul Preciado is a notorious thinker, a philosopher, but also known for his work as a trans activist, a male transgender international figure. The talk by Preciado was more than moving. Many describe it like an earthquake, because controversy was triggered by the very opening words. Preciado addressed the audience, saying the customary greeting, ladies and gentlemen, but also extended his greeting to those who were neither ladies nor gentlemen. He asked very pointedly, I believe, whether or not there was at least only one psychoanalyst in the audience who was openly queer, trans, or non-binary. The response was a glacial silence interrupted by nervous giggles. He continued asking whether any of the psychoanalytic institutions present at the meeting assume a responsibility for the current changes in what he called the epistemology of gender and sexuality. That is the way we think, we talk, and we theorize about gender and sexuality, as well as an acknowledgement of the limits of what we know about these issues. The audience immediately became divided between those who cheered and those who booed and demanded even that Preciado leave the premises. A woman expressed her anger so loudly that she was heard by Preciado from the stage, and she screamed, "We should not allow him to speak. He's Hitler." Well, this horrible comparison recognizes, on the one hand, Preciado's position as an important political leader. It paints him as an authoritarian and even dictatorial one. His speech was eventually interrupted by the organizers, who told Preciado that his time was up after he had only read 1/4 of the speech he had prepared. His presentation, nevertheless, was instantly captured and hundreds of cell phones, and the video recording became as viral as a leaked sex tape and sent waves across the world. The day after the talk, there were provisional transcriptions of the lecture in Spanish, in English, in Italian, and they all were already circulating virally online. Several approximate versions also were printed as well, not only the recorded. And in response to this circulation of non-authorized versions, Preciado produced a book with the original text plus an introduction describing this event, and appeared in 2020 in several languages. And here we have, it's very interesting, I don't know if we can see this very well, how in the translation, the presentation acquires different presentations, different also connotations, whereas in English is a question mark. Can the monster speak? In French is Je suis un monstre qui vous parle. I am a monster that speak. And the same variation appears both in the Italian and in the Spanish version. What was Preciado doing with this weird title? He was very wittily, because we see Report to an Academy of Psychoanalysis, he was very wittily making reference to a famous short story by Franz Kafka from 1917. The short story is called Report to an Academy. In the story, an ape named Red Peter is brought in front of an audience of academics to give an account of his experience. He had learned to behave like a human and is confronting an audience of experts and is explaining how this transformation happened, how now he has become almost human, transformed into the semblance, the appearance of an educated European. But he's ready to pull down his pants whenever he needs to show a bullet wound commemorating his capture in the African Gold Coast. Thus, Preciado exhibited himself in front of the psychoanalyst experts as a transsexual specimen, like Kafka's ape, who ironically claimed that he was as human as anyone else in the audience. And not only that, like Red Peter, also Paul Preciado was the result of a deliberate transformation. To remain with Kafka, I will invoke another important text by Kafka, which is the Metamorphosis. But let's pause for a second and tell you the context of where was this, what was this academy that Preciado was addressing. Those 3,500 in the audience were most all psychoanalysts who belong to the École Freudienne de Paris, the Freudian School of Paris, a group that was founded after in 1980, Jacques Lacan dissolved his school, the EOL is the École d'Orientation Lacanian. So it's École de la Cause Freudienne. That was the school of the Freudian cause where Preciado taught. That was the new institution that was formed after in 1980, not long before his death. Lacan dissolved the École Freudienne de Paris, the group that he had founded in 1964. And in 1981, a new school was created called the École de la Cause Freudienne. And this is where Preciado's lecture took place. The head of the newly created school was Jacques-Alain Miller, his son-in-law, and literary executive, who had total legal and financial control of Lacan's work. What is important to mention here is that we have already Preciado in a way, rejecting the situation he finds himself in, because he's saying, well, look, you are talking about women in psychoanalysis as if we were still in 1917. So in a way, he's pointing to a certain kernel of ignorance in psychoanalytic production. In a way, from the very get-go, Preciado is addressing maybe a point of ignorance for psychoanalysis, and also, ironically, quip. It might have been better to organize an event on the subject of white heterosexual middle-class men in psychoanalysis. What we see from the start is problematizing the issues. The lecture, in fact, addressed the heteronormativity and the binarism of psychoanalysis, which has been, we have to say, a sad tradition in psychoanalysis, Lacanian and otherwise, a tradition that led to pathologizing of non-normative expressions of gender and sexuality. Preciado mentioned the patriarchal colonial epistemology of sexual difference. By this, he meant the tradition in psychoanalysis of considering heterosexual, genital, reproductive, family-oriented inclination as the norm or the ideal, the supposed construction of health, a model where any deviation from this pattern will be pathologized. For instance, this is something maybe we need to reckon with today. Even in Freud, is one possible reading of Freudian corpus could include the expectation that any female subject will have to move her center of erotic enjoyment from the clitoris to the vagina in order to achieve full maturity, not only reproductively, but psychically. Freud also infamously compared the issue of female sexuality to the dark continent of Africa. For many, Preciado's speech was received as a provocation, but some even felt it was an attack. And a few others felt it was an interpellation, to quote philosopher Louis Althusser. This idea of interpellation, here I have the illustration, is what Louis Althusser defines as a material ritual of ideological recognition in everyday life. Someone who may present as female but carries a passport that says male may not be allowed to, for instance, to board the plane. Or maybe this also may be bringing issues of safety. This idea of interpellation by the philosopher Althusser had been developed, for instance, by Judith Butler, and who takes this idea of interpellation as generally related to gender. Butler argue that we are hailed, summoned, and we come into being as gender subjects when, in the very moment that somebody sanctions our being, our bodily existence with it's a girl or it's a boy, that statement interpellates us, and our being is sanctioned with a value of great ideological weight. Since the subject of ideology is also the psychoanalytic subject of the unconscious, there is something we have to reflect upon. How am I claimed by my name? How can I even claim my own name? How am I claimed by notions of identity? How am I perceived and receiving the world, affecting my sense of self when declaring myself a man, a woman, or something else, when declaring myself as trans, cis, or even when we declare ourselves as psychoanalysts? At the lecture in Paris, Preciado called himself a renegade, a mutant, someone who was once, quote, a woman in psychoanalysis, end quote. Having been assigned female at birth, like Kafka's ape, Preciado had mastered a mutation and extricated himself from that, quote, confined cage to enter another cage, granted, for at least of his own initiative, end quote. Acknowledging the alienating aspect of identity, he spoke from a place he described as the elective refashioned cage of a trans man, of the non-binary body, a political cage that is, in any case, maybe no better than that of men or women, but at least one that recognizes its status as a cage. Again, I'm quoting from Preciado's lecture. But what is this cage that Preciado is referring to? When Preciado asked how many psychoanalyst members of the École de la Cause were openly gay, and their response was a panicked silence, he admitted that he did not ask homosexual psychoanalysts to come out forcefully out of the closet, but rather what Preciado was doing was to ask heteronormative psychoanalysis to come out of the closet of the norm. Norms and concepts can work as cages, cages of gender, cages of sexuality that are constructs, of course. These cages are not unavoidable destinies, and they have a history. Preciado highlighted the fact that gender, sexuality, and transsexuality are historical constructions. If they are taken as universal, timeless categories, of course, they become cages. In this way, Preciado used history as an analytical tool for uncovering alternative and disturbed histories to explore what he calls the, quote, regime of gender, sex, and sexual difference, end quote. Because I agree with this historical reframing proposed by Preciado, I will share with you one chapter that I think has been unhappily forgotten in the history of psychoanalysis, and is quite important because it's a chapter in the history of psychoanalysis that falls outside the binary normative ideologies. An example outside, precisely, I would say, the same epistemology that Preciado criticizes. I will go back to the very early days of psychoanalysis, when Freud was just in the beginning, first publications, when the field of psychoanalysis was emerging. There was one important collaborator for psychoanalysis, a very important figure for the LGBTQ plus movement. And I'm referring to the so-called other Einstein of sex besides Freud, Magnus Hirschfeld. He was the founder of the world's first sexual research institute in Berlin, and he was a pioneer, not just a researcher in the emerging field of sexology, but also he was, besides being a clinician, an LGBT advocate who did groundbreaking work on transgenderism and published more than 2,000 articles on homosexuality and was considered sexually variant behaviors. He was a passionate sex reformer and an activist who was also an occasional cross-dresser and a very important figure in the history of the LGBTQ movement. And he was very important he was in charge of publishing a number of early psychoanalytic papers, including Freud's early psychoanalytic papers. He also directly played an important role in the history of psychoanalysis, because in 1908, he founded, sorry for the background noise. This is always a reminder that we don't practice in a vacuum. The social order is traversing, maybe here with a strong sound. In 1908, I was telling you, Carl Abraham founded with Hirschfeld. They co-founded the Psychoanalytic the Psychoanalytic Institute, the Psychoanalytic Society of Berlin, which is very important even today because their this is the group that created the prototype of the model of analytic formation. Today, any institute affiliated with the IPA, with the International Psychoanalytic Association, we will be following the Berlin model of training. So it's a very important society in the history of the psychoanalytic movement, one of the first created in the world, and Hirschfeld was one of the founders. But even though Hirschfeld was very warmly welcomed, this is the picture of the Third International Congress of Psychoanalysts in 1911, the Weimar Congress. He was received very warmly as an honored guest, and publicly Freud expressed his admiration for someone who he described as the Berlin authority on homosexuality. Even with this recognition, soon after Hirschfeld left the Berlin Psychoanalytic. Here is one of the best known works of Hirschfeld that took almost 90 years to be translated into English. Transvestites, the erotic drive to cross-dress. We have there a word that belongs to the psychoanalytic jargon, the drive, Triev, that was mistranslated as instinct. Hirschfeld uses it, of course, in a different connotation, but it's in a way an indication that he was not so far removed from the psychoanalytic world. On the contrary, he was an important key figure. Hirschfeld's departure, here we have another image of Hirschfeld, was described by Abraham as precipitated by an external cause, and again described in the letters with Freud as a question of resistance. In fact, apparently, it's, according to the biographers and the historical accounts, Jung objected to Hirschfeld open homosexuality. He would be cross-dressing in public, and his advocacy of homosexual rights was initially seen by Freud as a very positive development, and he had encouraged very openly Abraham to collaborate with Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld left with a very embittered departure. Then Freud felt very deeply personally wounded and said that, in fact, this was not such a huge loss. However, not long before the split, Freud had written to Jung expressing his wish to include sexologists in the psychoanalytic movement and insisted on the importance of this dialogue, this collaboration that was clearly outside the heterosexual normative idea of what psychoanalysis came to be. Both Freud and Hirschfeld opposed the criminalization of same-sex desire and did not consider it an abnormality in the pathological sense. They disagree, nevertheless, and this is very clear, about what caused homosexuality. We have here on the right, we see Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld believed in a biological cause for homosexuality. And it was maybe a political strategy to buttress his advocacy against the punishment of non-criminalization, in fact, of non-normative sexual manifestation. And he used the argument that this orientation was responding to a biological basis. Whereas Freud considered that childhood experiences determine unconscious libidinal tendencies and object choice. And also Freud's approach was clearly to separate sex from any biological or natural overdetermination. And what Freud did was to highlight what we may call the skewed character of human sexuality. One can read Freud in a normative patriarchal way, that would be possible, but one can also read Freud in a way that would give room for what I call a pink Freud, that could be maybe seen if we look at one foundational text of Freud. And here I'm referring to 1905, takes 3 essays on sexuality that conceives, for instance, of the notion of the sexual drive as fundamentally bisexual and intrinsically queer. This is something that has been a reading, has been done beautifully by Christopher Lane and Tim Dean, and I'm referring you for their text of 2001. Also, more recently, Philippe Van Houten and Herman Westerling have demonstrated, this is a book from 2017, and in which they do a very careful textual study that shows that the first edition of the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality did not mention the Oedipus complex and promoted a deheterosexual and polymorphous sexuality. So such a queerness of psychoanalysis has been echoed in the works of course, Judith Butler, who reads Freud beautifully, David Eng, Lee Edelman, and Preciado himself. So using the critical tools of psychoanalysis, queer studies, for instance, has shown that at the level of the sexual drive, there is no predetermined object or gender, and consequently, there couldn't be a prescriptive norm. The potential freedom of the sexual drive is a freedom that is also its doom. And this is an idea that does not sit well with the public, but even with most psychoanalysts. Psychoanalysis has had, maybe against its own theory, has been addressing reality through the lens of conservative values that go against the grain of psychoanalysis on foundations and its theory. And because, for instance, if we think of the work of many feminist theories, psychoanalysis has provided a very strong critique of the dominant heteropatriarchal culture. Let us know that Freud never dealt directly with gender, but he problematized human sexuality in a way that allows us to conclude that even though one could make a cursory reading of the 3 studies on sexual theory and maybe imagine that there is a progression from childhood latency to adult sexual activity, if we read Freud carefully, we could see that Freud, in fact, is saying that mature adult sexuality is polymorphous and perverse, that is infantile, in fact. So there is an idea of a non-linear evolution in Freud, and this can be confirmed if we quickly take a look at any of his clinical cases. So we can see that psychoanalysis denaturalizes sex in terms of culture and history and problematizes gender as unstable and conflicted. And of course, this allows us to reconsider patriarchal and heterosexist forms of cultural and ideological domination. And this is precisely what Preciado is doing and what he did very clearly in the lecture. That concludes with a recommendation that this time was interrupted with applause. And I think it's a wake-up call for us that could function also as a warning. He believed that the task that remains for psychoanalysts today is to begin a process of depatriarchalization, of deheterosexualization, and decolonization of our field. He ended with a plea for, quote, a mutant psychoanalysis around this paradigm mutation, perhaps only this process of transformation, however terrible and dismantling as it may seem to you, deserves today again to be called psychoanalysis, end quote. I will insist on the fact that Paul Preciado used Kafka's story, the report to an academy. A short story that can be read also as an allegory of difference and assimilation, maybe of Jewish difference and assimilation. For the ape, read Peter, freedom is not an option. His transformation is only a way out. The ape imitates the humans. He learns to shake hands, to smoke a pipe, even overcoming his initial revulsion, to drink brandy. After accomplishing all this, in one surprising moment, he breaks out in human speech and shouts to his captors, "Hello!" His successful mimicking of humans grants him an exit from the cage. Peter goes through a process of training and reaches the educational level of an average European, white male, we may add. His report to the academy was meant to share his experience, disseminate knowledge in order to change the epistemology, to quote Preciado. Kafka's story, in fact, goes beyond a meditation between humans and animals. It also touches on issues of race and colonialism. Where Red Ape can no longer remember his past animal life in the, quote, civilized life, his, quote, race is not held against him, but rather he's showered with attention and even admiration because of his race. His racial heredity is not an obstacle, but quite the opposite. Precisely because he is an ape, a member of an alien species. In an imperialist gesture, a native of Africa is captured, enslaved, and imported to Europe. A reverse frame, but a similar survivalist wish for assimilation was experienced by psychoanalysts when, before Second World War, made a forced migration to the United States to escape Nazi persecution. They have to leave because of racialized laws. Can we say, perhaps, that they engage in a failed process of decolonization? That first decolonization of psychoanalysis, we may call the Americanization of psychoanalysis, was clearly a failure because they were trying to make psychoanalysis less European, and then what they did was simply to medicalize the practice. This Americanizing of the unconscious erased sexuality and any political dimension. It also assumed that psychoanalysis was outside history. Perhaps a new type of decolonization of psychoanalysis is overdue. What we need would be perhaps not so much a focus on adaptation, on consensus, but rather maybe what we need is dissensus. And here I refer to the work of the philosopher Jacques Rancière, who proposes the idea of dissensus. This idea of dissensus was also an idea discussed in 1995, is contemporary with Rancière, both the Rancière text and the work of Jacques Hassoun. They work on the idea of dissensus. Dissensus, in fact, what it means is letting loose of contradictory, of divergent opinions. Literally means dissensus, meaning a process of reordering that may not come very naturally. It may be something we need to practice before we can learn it. Dissensus is the exact opposite of consensus. For Rancière, politics is not a matter of institutions or social arrangements, but a matter of what people do. And in particular, the power people have to disrupt. This disruption will lead to a more just social arrangement. Often we believe that consensus is good and dissensus is bad, but one may forget that disagreement is needed for change to occur. As we know, democracy relies on dissensus as much as on consensus. And maybe in the spirit of this census, while confronting the possibilities of limits of group organizations, I joined a loose collective for those who love psychoanalysis. And I here will quickly refer to a group created a decade ago under the name of Das Unbehagen. A number of clinicians, academics, artists, and intellectuals form an association for the investigation of psychoanalysis free from the constraints of institutes or other authorizing bodies, including local or national organizations. And this collective has been an experiment, a work in progress, still an experiment in process, that functions as a group of peers, creating a series of lateral connections that tries to revitalize psychoanalysis and the practice of psychoanalysis in an ethical manner. And there is a network of clinical study groups, reading groups, peer supervision. And the idea is to create support structures for those taking on analytic work independently. In the US, Das Unbehagen is mostly, has had repercussions in other geographical locations, but it's mostly a US-based analyst trying to give new impetus to the idea of discontent, perhaps, but also to propose this idea of this census, because there are no dues, no membership, no board, no leader. Everyone can participate with their own ideas and propositions, and participants may belong to many institutions, may have different orientations in their practice, but the key is that nobody can be excluded and nobody has ever been excluded. If the setting makes room for this census, then we can accept differences, that is, discuss, disagree, and talk with one another. And so we have this idea of dissidence. There are other examples of dissidence. Maybe we could think of dissidence in Latin America, where the practices of psychoanalysis have been always eminently political and associated with social justice. This is a trend that we can observe worldwide. We know that there are many examples of dissidences from a normative model, the so-called regime, as Preciado calls it. And in a way, we have worldwide examples of what precisely Preciado is calling for. It's interesting, this idea of dissidence, because Preciado himself identifies as, quote, a dissident of the regime of sex and gender, end quote. We all need, in fact, to respond in a way to this wake-up call of Preciado. And maybe I would see this as an antidote to the obsolescence of psychoanalysis. We should be able to understand the questions that Preciado is posing that are very relevant, not just for the theory, but they in fact have an application in the very practice of psychoanalysis. I would say that my point of view here, I take distance from Preciado because I'm not a philosopher, I am not a trans activist, I am a psychoanalyst, and I define my work as that of a practitioner of the unconscious. I would argue that the unconscious is our ally because the unconscious doesn't know of any binaries. I do not share all of Preciado's critical statements about psychoanalysis, but I, however, follow his drift of his indictment of the psychoanalytic history of pathologization of non-normative expressions of gender and sexuality. My itinerary has been guided by my own practice, my own critique of psychoanalysis and sexual difference. It had started with my practice in Philadelphia's Barrio, a place that, at least in the context of the United States, have been considered beyond the reach of the psychoanalysis, or even beyond the reach of the unconscious. I work in an inner city mental health clinic with a population that could be considered in the terms that Gramsci proposes of subalterns, as revisited through the work of Gayatri Spivak. What I began to hear in the practice, something called my attention in the clinical presentation of suffering, when some of the patients, for instance, wonder, am I straight or am I bisexual? I noticed that what they were expressing in this way was a variation of the question, am I a man or what is a woman? And this led me to pose a more generalized question that I maybe concluded when an analysand shared with me, for instance, I have the worst defect a woman can have. I was born with a penis and a pair of testicles. Or another who said, I always knew I was a man even when I was a girl. This comment, I think, sent us through maybe to questions that we may call more ontological, because they are rooted in their very existence, the very existence of these people, and whether or not life was livable, and how to make life livable. So in a way, we need to revise, guided by the clinic, perhaps the Freudian and the Lacanian metapsychology, and maybe confront once more the death drive. This is, and I said it many times, but I think it's worth repeating that working with trans-identified analysands, one important, I think, very important lesson I learned is that the concern behind the concern of gender and sexuality, there is often an issue of life and death. And this is something, for instance, that Griffin Hansberry had defined when he said that gender transition itself is a kind of death. This is an aspect that perhaps escaped me when I first intervened, sharing my clinical experience. This is my book from 2010, where maybe I was too much of a Lacanian psychoanalyst. And as Preciado would quip, I had focused on the problem of sexuality and gender without seeing that, in fact, the boundary, the issue in question, and this is something I developed in Psychoanalysis Needs a Sex Change, with my initial title is the idea that there is a transition that psychoanalysis needs to do, which is moving towards what I call today a transgender psychoanalysis. The idea that if somebody says, I had no choice, today I would be dead if I would not have made the transition. We see that these are issues of life or death. So, in fact, what the transition would be about is finding a way of being. So I will insist that when Preciado is talking about the old epistemology of sex, of gender and sexual difference, my question to Preciado, my answer would be, well, this is not so much about gender and sexuality. This is about life or death. And so to further respond to Preciado's questions, I would say that normativity is untenable from a psychoanalytic perspective, because any sexual positioning is a failed way of being. Whether or not that person is a woman, being a man, being a woman, or being anything else in between, are failed way of being. In that sense, what we see is that trans desire offers us a new way of resignifying the assumption of what it means to live in a body that needs to declare a gender in order to exist in society, that knows that is mortal. That from this perspective, we can say that trans identification is as problematic as cis identification, that both, again, are failures in the face of an enigma without a clear solution. When somebody changes their gender, we see that the possibility of embodying a different gender from the one they were assigned at birth, we see clearly that the body is something one becomes. one is not born into a body, but is a sort of, we need to assume that one, in fact, becomes a body. And I think when Preciado argues that, and here is my first important disagreement with Preciado, he argues that sexual difference is neither an empirical reality nor a determining symbolic order of the unconscious, quote, unquote, nor, quote again, an epistemology of the living, an anatomical mapping, a political economy of the body, and a collective administration of reproductive energies, end quote. I would say that the assumption, in response to Preciado, of a sex body is a process in which each person makes a choice that does not fully depend on anatomical differences or even its psychic consequences, or on social conventions. I would say that for psychoanalysis, sexual difference is not an epistemology, but a short circuit in epistemology and in ontology. As Preciado notes, and here is quite in agreement with what we may say from a psychoanalytic perspective, both gender and pathology are historical constructions. And I would propose to Preciado what I call transgender psychoanalysis. This idea that for the unconscious, there is no sexual difference. In fact, there is it's a binary of 1 and 0. There is only 1. In fact, there are nothing but impasses at the unconscious level. That sexual difference introduce a difficulty, a problem that any resolution is a failed one. The etiology of gender incongruence remains unknown for biologists and for psychoanalysts, and that gender is in fact an attribution, is something assigned from the outside the subject and without the subject's consent. And it is often, for instance, inscribed in someone's birth certificate, and is done a few days after that life has started. So in the birth certificate of the newborn, there will be a marker of gender assigned long before that child is able to speak. Here, Preciado in the talk appeals, and this is the slide you're looking at, and he claims that a trans person can be equated with an intersex person, and he even calls himself intersex by design. I think it's a little of a leap here, because the intersex and the trans movements are perhaps at opposite ends concerning body manipulations made accessible by technological developments. While the intersex movement opposes unwanted surgery, the trans people are calling for elective surgery. I think, nevertheless, one point in common that they share is the notion that gender should be a choice rather than an external coercive assignment. But the question here is, what degree of autonomy is entailed then in such exercise of self-determination? From a psychoanalytic perspective, sexual identity is not determined by biology or any other innate factor. Sexual identity is learned through a language one is born into and through the given dynamics of identifications. And we know that identity is always aleatory, constructed around a loss that dates to that inaugural moment, this mythical moment of bliss, a pre-gender wholeness, when we fell into sexual difference. The instant that I mentioned, when someone's being is sanctioned with it's a girl or it's a boy. For psychoanalysis, unconscious choice has nothing to do with voluntaristic free will. In this choice, these alternatives are not symmetric, they are not isomorphous. There is always a sense of discordance between one's, for instance, erogenous sex and one's declared sex. So what is important, I think, in that sense, the contributions of Preciado are very valuable, because we are seeing in our practices, and the statistics seem to confirm that the trans community is more openly declaring their identity, that right now, according to most recent statistics, we had statistics of 2017 was 2% of the US population identified themselves as trans. Now it's 5%, especially for the younger generations. So we may have in our practices analysts who, like Paul Preciado, do not think that they are in the wrong body. That's, I think, a complete construction. No longer is the clinical presentation somebody that would say, I was born in the wrong body, but we hear a lot analyses that tell us that the gender binary doesn't fit them, that their identity is non-binary or that they are agender, that they do not identify either as female or as male. So we are learning to maybe be more thoughtful about using language, about following a person's pronoun. We have many analyses that identify neither she or he, but they refer to themselves as using they. And they may not want to change their gender. They may or may not take hormones to redistribute muscle and change how their appearance is, or those who may choose to inhabit the space between the binary. So one truth to challenge this myth of the wrong body is that the transgender fan here, I'm quoting Juliet Jacques, that says that she didn't feel trapped in her body, that the real trap was the society that would not let her modify it. One of the truths of the transgender phenomenon is that body and gender consistency is a fiction that is assumed through identification. So it would be completely absurd to ascribe to anatomy the role of normalizing in a typified modality of sexuality that is focused on the genital or on a single prescribed act, as classical psychoanalysis may have done it. So it's clearly that the trans experience has challenged the absurdity of such a construction. Today, our analyses are telling us that maybe the gender they were assigned at birth does not align with the way they feel, the way they identify, in clearly showing that anatomy is not destiny. And this analysis no longer talk about gender reassignment. They talk about gender realignment or gender confirmation surgery. So in a way, these semantic uses are pointing to a different position, maybe a different state, or maybe the corroboration of a truth contradicted perhaps by the flesh. And what I think is important, that what I have learned from what we may call trans-identified analysis could also apply to cis-identified analysis. That is that the challenge of assuming a body that perhaps may need to be different from how it was, that the experience becomes like a work of art, becomes an artistic endeavor. And there is an art similar to that of actual artists, perhaps, in trans artificiality. I have suggested, and this is what I have done in elsewhere and in other publications, that what we see in the trans experience is the application of the function of art in a way that affects the life of everyone, trans, cis, alike. And this is betrayed, perhaps, by the use in language when we say, I have a body, rather than I am a body. To conclude, today I would like to imagine a different future for psychoanalysis, and thus to respond to Paul Preciado's wish, I would referred to something he said in an interview by political condition of the unconscious, and that it should question the, quote, patriarchal colonial model of the body and the normative idea of subjective interiority, end quote. Preciado is asking psychoanalysis to abandon, quote, a sort of monopoly over dreams and imagination and an obsession with the family plot, end quote. Preciado is observing that psychoanalysis, quote, is at odds with reality now, with what's shifting, and proposes a mutant psychoanalysis that is, quote, not a quest for interiority, but a space for collective transformation of consciousness, end quote. So, by giving Red Peter human attributes, the writer Kafka challenges human superiority in intelligence and morals. Likewise, Preciado embraces Red Peter's position as a monster by virtue of the transgression of the boundaries between animal and human that is represented by a speaking ape. Preciado speaks to us, analysts, making us aware of the dehumanizing consequences of psychoanalytic prejudice. We know that Freud, for instance, never considered same-sex desire pathological, that in fact the question here would be asked, Danny Novus posed, and I quote, that is the question of Freud's supposed normative tendencies. I quote, Danny Novus says, why does anyone ever become sexually normal, end quote. Normal is weird. Furthermore, as Robert Stoller noted for psychoanalysis, quote, normal has no meaning. What is that person or aspect? No analyst has ever recorded such a case. Met one as a patient, not one in oneself, one's loves, one's friends, one's colleagues. Not to elaborate this point. It is obvious, universally known, usually denied, end quote. We know that, nevertheless, besides the impossibility of finding anyone normal, until 1973, for the American Psychiatric Association, homosexuality had been a mental disorder, but it took 20 more years, 20, for psychoanalysts to stop considering homosexuality a pathology. And under the threat of an anti-discrimination lawsuit in 1991, the American Psychoanalytic Association allowed the training of gay and lesbian psychoanalysts. Maybe the American Psychoanalytic Association turned a corner, because in 2019, during Gay Pride Month, the American Psychoanalytic Association apologized for previously treating homosexuality as a mental illness and saying that its past errors contributed to discrimination and trauma for LGBTQIA+ people. So, unlike the experience of many psychoanalysts, perhaps those who Preciado encountered in 2019 in the audience, we have maybe broken away from the constraints of our office with the pandemic. We were embarking in Zoom treatments, everybody reduced to the stamp in a Zoom screen. Analysts have been getting ahead despite of everything. In my own practice, and in the case of many colleagues I have talked to, I saw a great increase in my workloads. Many patients have managed to make good progress in the middle of a global catastrophe. Nothing like a deadly global pandemic to remind us of mortality. Facing death, many failed. There was no time to procrastinate. So it's important, maybe in the context of a virus that was not an equalizer, rich and poor were not affected equally. Moreover, in the US, Black and brown Latinx people have been 3 times more likely than whites to get COVID-19 and were killed in the highest numbers. So we see that the long-standing inequities by race, ethnicity, and income maybe became more explicit. So in a way, this makes us look back to clinical experience like mine in the barrio, where we are working with marginalized, racialized communities that suffer high rates of mortality. And there we can see that psychoanalysis can, in the practice, function like a life-affirming practice, like an anti-colonial practice, that psychoanalysis has an emancipatory potential of great importance for oppressed minorities, that psychoanalysis not only deals with the unconscious repressed conflict, it also encouraged the exploration of fantasy, giving great importance to dream life as a metaphor of desire, that free association could maybe open, since we are discussing the future of psychoanalysis, a space of futurity beyond the constraints of repetition, enabling the capacity for change at both a personal and societal level. That psychoanalysis, instead of enforcing oppressive adaptation to oppressive social conditions, makes for subjective agency at the intersection of psyche and community. We can address modalities of individual suffering that are also allegories of sexual and social conditions, so that the sexual is traversed by the social. So it's important to see all these levels in a step to maybe imagine this psychoanalysis to come, making psychoanalysis perhaps accessible to all. I will maybe quickly reach the conclusion, because I want to have time for discussion, to go maybe to transcend our current situation, maybe to go beyond trans, and to maybe scandare, to climb, to maybe move to the future, to what is to come for psychoanalysis. And maybe we need to start thinking about a new normal, and perhaps taking inspiration of, I have noticed a recent, and I welcome this as a positive development, clear politicization of the conversation in psychoanalysis, that we are seeing that psychoanalysis may have a role to play, a role that was already presented by Freud when, in the Question of Lay Analysis, that's a text from 1926, he chooses the use of the word laikos, that in this text, not only is Freud criticizing the idea that not doctors but lay people were better suited to become psychoanalysts, his choice of word insisted on inclusivity, since lay derives from the late Latin laicus, from the Greek laikos, of the people. So it may sound paradoxically, perhaps, to talk about the future in psychoanalysis, given the fact that Freud said that the unconscious doesn't know of time. And maybe he was perhaps accused, Freud, of putting too much emphasis in a determination of the past, but he staunchly refused to consider that dreams might be prophetic, so many ancient dream interpretations claim. Jung attacked him on this point, objecting to an excessive regard for the past. However, if we look at dreams, what is interesting, we look at the royal path to the unconscious, we may observe a different temporality. In dreams, the past, the future, and the present coexist. Dreams, moreover, introduce the immediacy of the now. They're often recounted in the present tense. William Butler Yeats wrote in a poem, "In dreams begins responsibility, which suggests an ethical notion of dreaming." We have an ethical unconscious. Responsibility also ushers in the notion of freedom. When we understand what freedom entails, we begin to take distance from the determinism of the past. Therefore, it's not an exaggeration to state that psychoanalysis proposes an ethical awareness and opens up to the dimension of the future. Someone goes to see an analyst, most likely to imagine a different future, even if this futurity depends on what the philosopher Martin Heidegger described as an awareness of radical finitude, the being for death. For Heidegger, this being for death is the condition of an authentic relation to life. In this echoes both Jung and Lacan. Psychoanalysis then appears less focused on the past, tell me about your childhood, as future-oriented. It works to reconcile us with life insofar as we learn to live with the death drive. In psychoanalysis, the future opens a path that goes from the individual events falling into the fault lines of trauma to the collective, as the idea of the future involves always others. We may go to war to save a nation. We may go to war for an ideal, for others. Clinical work specifically opens a path towards figuring out how to live with the death drive, which paradoxically renders life possible and even more livable. The English language here is quite revealing, since we grammatically construct the future by saying, I will, revealing a life force desire, the ethical compass of psychoanalysis. When we repeat Martin Luther King's famous phrase, I have a dream, the phrase proves that we are both turned to the past and the future. Dreams endlessly recycle previous image, but they call for a possible livable future of realized desire. And I will end with the proposition to return to a dissident psychoanalysis inspired by a queer, pink Freud, the Freud that in 1918 believed that, quote, I quote, the poor person has as much right to assistance for their mind as they now have for the life-saving help offered by surgery. Freud, and here is on the left, you have the image of the book by Elizabeth Danto. He supported actively the network of free clinics for the working class that opened between the two world wars, 10 cities and 7 countries clinics. So I want to insist in this period in the history of psychoanalysis, with the 20s, 1930s, where the second generation of psychoanalysts was active in the free clinics. And it's important to know that this movement had included several very distinguished and active women analysts in leadership positions. Among them were Karen Horney, Helen Deutsch, Anna Freud, Edith Jackson, and Melanie Klein. Interwar psychoanalysis was not only alert to injustice in society, it was also an international movement, as documented by Elizabeth Danto. So, to conclude, I would say that following their example, we psychoanalysts need to learn more from the dissidents of the social sexual order. Let us follow an ethics of difference, sexual, racial, and otherwise, an ethics of pure difference. It's time for psychoanalysis to transition. Thank you very much. And I think we have time for questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Patricia. But just to start off, I don't want to take too much time, but it's quite interesting the extreme response that he got. I was sort of quite struck by that. You said someone even shouting and saying he's Hitler, and and I was wondering about that. You know, the how the power dynamics and how the way things are defended, and in such an extreme way. Has there been? Well, I was wondering your thoughts on that, and also, has that society, has there been communication within them about that response since
Yeah.
since 2019. Yeah.
There had been a lot of response to the point that then Jacques Alain Miller declared 2021 the trans year, the year of trans. So I think what is interesting is that there have been a lot of discussion, many publications, books written in response to the speech, besides Paul Preciado's publishing his own text. There have been many texts produced in response. But what you mentioned, Mike, that I think is very important is something that is an interesting anecdote that was observed by the philosopher Alenta Supanki. She talks about this early black and white film about the life of Freud. I think it's a film from the 50s, in which you have a lecture given by Freud early in his career, and he's proposing, we may say, a discussion on human sexuality that shocks the audience, and everybody is a huge riot in this very formal medical auditorium. He was referring to the early presentation of Freud when, after his return, studying in Paris with Charcot about hysterical symptoms, he makes the terrible mistake of presenting a case of male hysteria. And so something touching our notions of gender, if hysteria was at the time, because the etymology would relate to hysterum, the uterus in Greek, would then, how could he present a case of male hysteria, someone who does not have a uterus? There was a nice, interesting comment that somebody said, gentlemen, calm down. This looks like a political meeting. That kind of riot would only be elicited by political discussion. And it points to the fact that we cannot talk about sexuality without being a political statement, that in a way these two elements are interrelated. And here I think I praise the fact that Preciado was invited to be a keynote. On the one hand, there is an openness to what Preciado has to say, but the response was also experienced as a personal attack. I have to say, I invite you, if you go on YouTube, there are many recordings and many are subtitled. So you may be able to find one with English subtitles, that there was a slight provocation in the style of Preciado. But what I think is important is that the letter arrived to its destination, because the audience immediately responded viscerally to this political questioning. And I think that we also may think that there is something in the identity of psychoanalysis that can be so easily shaken by this type of questioning and this type of discourse. So I think it's an indication of maybe something of the order of a symptom that could, if we use the Lacanian terminology, move from being simply a symptom to becoming a symptom. And by this, I refer to what Lacan theorizes as something that is not something we need to cure, but rather something that makes somebody maybe exist in the world. So that perhaps as a psychoanalyst, we need to move from the knee-jerk reaction onto perhaps take the criticism. Or I think that also Preciado is in transference with psychoanalysis. Otherwise, we would not have accepted the invitation and cares about psychoanalysis and is functioning as a good wake-up call for analysts. It's calling us to occupy our place.
Thank you, Patricia. We've got Penelope.
Yeah, thank you very much, Patricia. I was just wondering if you could repeat that bit about where you mentioned Heidegger towards the end with his Sein zum Tode. If I wanted, because I asked you expressly if you could repeat it, because I'm interested in it and I didn't quite get the link.
the link is that often we hear, even I would use examples from popular culture, times for issues of confidentiality, and it's confirmed in the practice. Like Caitlyn Jenner described her transition as following this discourse of authenticity. Now I'm my real self. I was all along a woman, and now I can be in a more authentic way. And often we see, at least in the example in the context of the United States, the gender transition is often described in terms of authenticity. I'll be my true self. And that, for me, brought up echoes of Heidegger with the idea of authenticity. And I think there is something about authenticity that goes beyond the imaginary, the idea of a self that is alienated, but rather that authenticity or authentic life has to do with a confrontation with death or with the death drive that often you hear from trans-identified analysts a mentioning of transition as a rebirth or as a second life. But I wouldn't say second life, I would say going from a first death to a second death. And that's why I was quoting the idea of transition as a kind of death, or when somebody says, if I would not have transitioned, I would have killed myself, or I was thinking about killing myself. And then the idea of transitioning occurred to me, and that allowed me to be able to exist in the world. That, in fact, this being for death, this traversal of a first death and a second one allows life to be possible. And that has echoes of what Lacan develops in the seminar on ethics, about apropos of Antigone, in the idea of traversing a second death. But it's something that we hear that people, and we have, it's a sort of recurrent feature in many of those who have transitioned, this reference to being dead alive, and through the transition, life becomes livable, which for me is the more interesting way of approaching what the transition is about, and also the urgency and the ethical position that we are called to occupy as psychoanalysts, that we are accompanying someone in a journey of making life possible, of being able to be in the world, that takes into account the death drive, because there is also what I was referring is there has been in psychoanalytic thinking for many years a suppression of the notion of death drive, that in fact, if we can, as it were, live with the death drive, life becomes livable.
That was it, yeah. It was that bit, yeah, exactly that last bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Patricia, I've got a question, someone that don't want to be on screen, from Mercer. She's saying, speaking of male hysteria, please address Freud's treatment of Dora and how Freud imposed patriarchal sexual customs into the unconscious of an adolescent girl.
Yes, indeed. I think we see in Dora that the failure of that analysis, and it's something that Freud could only become aware in the 1920s, so that's much later after the case. The case of Dora is contemporary, where the time he was writing the interpretation of dreams, in fact, was a case that he wanted to publish as an illustration of dream analysis. That's why in the report of the case, we have a lengthy description of Dora's dreams, right? Talking about Freud's mistakes, blind spots, patriarchal heteronormative prejudice. He fails because he applies an heteronormative model of sexual orientation. But we could do as Juliet Mitchell does, and I'm referring here to how she reads that case in the introduction to the publication of Lacan text on feminine sexuality, is that he is at the beginning being very heteronormative, assuming that Dora was in love with Mr. K, when already in that heterosexist way of thinking. Also, Freud is aware that he's in a sort of fascination, and that then he adds a footnote in the 20s, after he had developed several texts on feminine sexuality. He admits to his mistake and leaves that in print for us to learn from his experience. In that sense, he is very generous, not been hiding his limitations and his prejudice. He's working through it. That's why it goes from the symptom to the symptom, we may say. And he admits that the object of love for Dora was Mrs. K, that in a way he becomes aware that if Dora had was maintaining any relationship with Mr. K, and for those who are not familiar with the case, Dora was a teenager who is brought to analysis by her father, a father who was having an extramarital affair and was recruiting the help of Dora to babysit the children of his lover, so he could have an encounter with his lover, but also it was exchanged in a sordid way, given away to the husband of his lover, and there's this horrible system of exchanges. The problem we see with Dora, maybe it's an interesting issue for us to discuss today, is not only the heterosexist prejudice that Freud quickly became aware of, that he was looking at the wrong object of interest, but I was referring to Juliet Mitchell because she says that Dora loves Mrs. K like a man. So already that comment of Freud tells us that if a woman can love like a man, another woman, we can see that in this drive, it's impossible to maintain an heteronormative trajectory. So I think it's important to learn from Freud's mistakes, and he already in the 20s is correcting. And if we look at the text that he writes in 1920, he's aware of a place that he feels he can go further. And that's why he then makes these complicated statements as feminine sexuality, as the dark continent, that on the one hand, we see that Freud left off at a place where he couldn't go further, but that he left us also a place where when we can pick up where he left off. And maybe this is the heritage to deal with today, that there is a possibility, as Preciado is asking us, if we think of a future of psychoanalysis, we of course need to go beyond the mistakes of the past. And most importantly, like Freud did, learn from our mistakes.
And then we've got Penelope. I think it's raised her hand.
Just on that note, quickly, there's going to be a talk soon about Lacan's Dora. Somebody called Henrietta something Dora Markovic. A talk by Danny Nobis. I just wanted to add that. Apparently,
oh, wonderful. When is that? I'll take a note. When is that talk?
So Danny Nobis is going to give a talk at the with whatever his name is. That's South African in America.
Derek Hook.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you have a link for it? I wonder if they can put it in the chat.
Derek Hook is putting on an ECRI conference soon in October, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So at that talk, Danny Nobis is going to, at that event, Danny Nobis is going to give a talk about Lacan's Dora. There you go. I just wanted to say that because I just found out and I thought it was interesting.
Yep.
Thanks, Penelope.
Okay. I just want to say thank you so much for this presentation today. It just so happens that I had my first session with an intersex client, and what stood out for me amongst a lot of what you said today, this evening, is to end intersex surgery, because their body is mutilated almost beyond recognition in trying to assign a sex agenda to her, to them. Sorry, I'm still sort of preferring to them as her. So thank you so much. It really has.
Yeah, it's very, very important. That's why I disagree with this use, I think, of Preciado, of the idea that defining themselves as intersex by design, because the problem precisely in intersex is there is no design. It's an imposition. And that is also calling us as psychoanalysts, because when a child is born with a anatomical structure that cannot easily put in practice interpolation, is a boy, is a girl, is declared a medical emergency. And we know the work of many people who had done research on intersex. There is nothing at risk in that baby is healthy, that newborn is completely healthy. And we live in a society where we have to impose by force a binary, and this Procrustean bed of gender would force a child to undergo at times a very tragic destiny. And the word that the pediatricians, the doctors use denotes a sort of a prevalence of the psychoanalytic jargon. Today we cannot talk about sexuality without using a psychoanalytic vocabulary, which is interpolating us as psychoanalysts. And they do something that Anne Fausto Sterling calls a phallometrics, because this body part in the genitals, they call it phallus. They use psychoanalytic terminology, and they are the doctors have infantile sexual theories like Freud described them, because if it's long, X amount of millimeters or centimeters, declare that child a boy. If it's shorter, they call it girl. So we see that we are, in a way, projecting onto the flesh a universe of fantasies and sexual fantasies and notions about sexual difference, that then we see how what is in common in the intersex movement and the trans movement, that we are talking about civil rights, in fact. They become civil rights issues. And that maybe I recently had the great pleasure and honor of being in the thesis committee for a doctoral student who finished her doctorate in Rio de Janeiro as a psychoanalyst working in a hospital where children were they decided whether or not they needed surgery when they had intersex conditions, and making room for the unconscious of the parents, of the pediatricians, of society, allow for a little bit of freedom, which can be quite a lot.
Yeah.
So we as psychoanalysts, we have a role to play.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne. Thank you so much, Patricia.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the opportunity. And let's think together of what is to come.
Yeah, and I think on this, is it the 2nd of December, we're going to talk about your new book, I think.
I think so, yes.
I think so, yeah. But I'll put it
Psychoanalysis, Gender and Sexuality, from Feminism to Trans. It's a collection of essays, so we are planning to be here with my co-editor, Manja Steinkoller, and we could maybe revisit some of the elements we were discussing today, and also we will share with you. We have 18 fantastic chapters from an international community, so a lot to talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.